Here we are frying the 2021 Christmas turkey off of my solar system, making a whopping 200 something watts. That's from a 7,770 watt nameplate PV array. So yeah, not doing screamingly great. That's 4.5 kilowatts. That's 3,270 watts. And yeah, pulling a bunch of load on that L2, which is the leg that the fryer is connected to, and then 180 something watts, which is the refrigerator, and a couple of lights. And of course, Sol-Ark is running totally off grid. So yeah, the main issue that people have with these things and them puking is really surge loads on one of the two legs, and there'll be an addendum at the end of this video explaining why that's an issue with the Sol-Ark and other similar transformerless topology inverters. There's my backup Sol-Ark, 84 watts from a string of 5 327 watt sun powers. And there's the extension cord that is feeding the fryer. Again, they recommend not having extension cords and what have you. It's something that can be done, but A, quality extension cords, B, check temperatures. Like if something gets hot, stop it immediately. And that's also where a thermal imaging camera, or, well, this is a multimeter, but it's got a thermal imaging camera built into it, is useful. And especially those thermal imagers you can get for like a few $100s nowadays. So, definitely a useful tool to have, and not just for this. And then there's the Sol-Ark system main breaker box. And the electricity meter for the main breaker box. Spinning away. And the sun's coming out a bit, relatively speaking. There's the extension cord junction right there. There's the fryer in the process of coming up to temperature. Slowly but surely. And there's the oil flavoring bacon. There's the turkey, 40 minutes in to the cooking process. A bit over 40 minutes. Probably got about another like 15 to 20 to go. And there's the finished turkey.
Anyway, have you been?
And a bunch of the turkey's been eaten. And now for the explanatory section of the video. Why the Sol-Ark can poop when running 120 volt surge loads or half-wave rectified loads is it has to do with how the neutral midpoint for the 120 volts is generated, because again, between L1 and L2 there's going to be RMS 240 volts. The way that the HOTS are generated inside the Sol-Ark 12K is there's a pair of half bridges pulling each HOT to either a positive DC HOT or a negative DC HOT, which are going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 190 to 220 volts DC, absolute value with respect to neutral / ground. It doesn't strictly matter which absolute potential they are, and for purposes of simplicity, I'm just going to call them plus minus 200 volts, because if they're not those values, they're not that far off. Now the midpoint, or the neutral, is generated in turn with a capacitive divider, because you've probably seen circuits, if you've done any kind of power electronics study or what have you, where if you have a H bridge, which is going to be spitting out a signal with no DC offset, so effective overall duty cycle is going to be 50%. What you can do is you can cheat and not use a full bridge of transistors. And again, I've drawn them as MOSFETs here, but in practice they could easily be IGBTs, and given the time at which the Sol-Ark was developed, they could easily be IGBTs. But type of transistor doesn't matter for this example. I mean, they could be bipolar junction transistors, and this example would still work in terms of why it's a problem. That midpoint being derived from this capacitive divider, when, say, a 120 volt load is connected to L1, when L1 has an absolute potential over that of the midpoint, well, positive with respect to the midpoint, is what will happen is one of these capacitors is going to be discharged, this one, and this capacitor is going to be charged, because again, the potential between these is effectively fixed. Then, when L1 goes negative, 8 1/3 seconds later, and again, I'm grossly simplifying because this is going to be PWM'd at, in the ultrasonic range, and then there's going to be filtering. Again, this is the very simplified circuit just to explain why this is a problem. When L1 goes negative, then that capacitor is going to be charged, that one's going to be discharged. And that swaps every 120th of a second for, a 60th of a second. Again, grossly simplifying here. What happens when you have either a surge load on one of the hots to the neutral, or you have a half-wave rectified load, is L1 is only ever sourcing current, or it's ever sinking current. Because again, you think about this with a regular AC load, there's going to be current coming in half the time and going out half the time. And because, currents, you've got negative current when you've got negative potential, negative times negative is a positive, so you still get positive instantaneous power. When it's positive and you've got positive current, positive times positive, it's positive, positive instantaneous power. Basic power theory. Granted, this is stuff I've come across in my own research because college doesn't explain this stuff worth dick. If you've had a number of college degrees like I do, you've almost certainly seen this, and if you've seen the dumpster fire that contemporary academia is, then, well, yeah, this is obvious stuff for you. But yeah, it is, so what happens, anyways, rant on the dumpster fire that is contemporary higher education aside, and education in general, really, for all that matter, is because L1 or L2, whichever one it's on, is only ever sinking current or only ever sourcing current, it pulls the charge balance in these two capacitors out of whack. And the inverter sees that, oh, there's a problem here, and it gives you the beep beep of unhappiness and the red light of there's a problem here. And this is why it's an issue with inverters like the Sol-Ark 12K, because Sol-Ark 12K isn't the only thing that uses something like this type of topology. This is also why this has not been an issue with things like the Midnight Solar B17 inverters, or for their B17 combination system, and their Rosie inverter, both of which are entering beta stages. Because the potential converters in those don't do this. Those have actually either two separate potential converters. Again, I haven't had a chance to look at one. Those either have a potential converter that generates the positive 200 volts and a potential converter that generates the negative 200 volts, or they have a 3-output potential converter that generates both of those rails. But because those have an absolute thing, they don't care if there's a half-wave thing. They don't care, at least within the thermal margins and the power handling capacities of the components and the potential converters, because they're not depending on that cat bridge that inverters like the Sol-Ark and similar do. And again, this is something which, again, if you're only dealing with, say, 240 volt surge loads where the whole thing is being carried by the H bridge, and for all intents and purposes the cat bridge wouldn't be there because it's only feeding 240 volt loads, it doesn't really give a monkeys. But yeah, it's this is basically why it can be an issue. Again, grossly simplified, but this is why. It's really just a matter of the inherent design of the Sol-Ark 12K, and it would require fairly major reworkings of the internal hardware. And again, it's why Sol-Ark went with modifying and improving an existing inverter, the Ningbo, the series of hybrid inverters in the case of the Sol-Arks, then trying to develop their own project from scratch, because those of you who've been following the half-decade plus long saga of designing the B17 and Rosie, Barcelona charge controller, Hawke's Bay charge controller, it takes a while designing your own hardware. And again, this coming from a guy who's tried to design his own MPPT charge controller like 8 or 9 years ago.